думаю, что все возможно в современном мире. Но я уже говорил, и это понятно для всех, что это будет в одном шаге от полномасштабной Третьей мировой войны. Думаю, что в этом вряд ли кто-нибудь заинтересован.
Russia's war strategy will either facilitate the decline of NATO's power or start World War III. Russia issued severe attacks on Ukraine as peace talks in Saudi Arabia get underway, and a U.S. envoy is meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Russia. It is the U.S. that will chart the course, and, for now, it is shifting the winds of political change in Russia's favor. The U.S. is not providing aid or intelligence to Ukraine and is distancing itself from NATO and European allies. The Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022 wasn't the start of a new war, but the latest chapter in an old strategy put in place by Putin in 2007. That was when he delivered a warning in a speech in Munich. He accused the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, called NATO, of deliberately expanding into Eastern Europe after promising it wouldn't move 1 foot east. Putin also didn't like the amount of global control the US had through NATO and other organizations. His speech began the long game that resulted in 1.2 million Russians and Ukrainians dead, and the latest attack in Ukraine. Could the conflict between Russia and Ukraine start World War III? What do each want in negotiating peace? How much power does the US carry in ending the war? Let's back up and unpack this complicated story of Russia's strategy and see what role the US plays. Hit the subscribe button to make sure you are informed more about this topic. The central dilemma in this rivalry is whether Ukraine should be allowed to join NATO. That would violate an agreement established in 1991, and such a move could start a world war. The US plays a crucial role in how global power is balanced. Currently, President Donald Trump is downplaying NATO's power, as well as those of our European friends. The shift in power from global organizations like NATO to individual countries like the US is where Putin is winning the long game. Breaking up global power and putting a cap on US influence, economic power, and political control around the world is his endgame. You must understand history to understand Putin's mindset. Let's start by looking at the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, formerly named the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, controlled Eastern Europe and most of Eurasia from 1922 to 1991. It stretched from the Black and Baltic Seas all the way to the Pacific Ocean. It had 14 republics besides Russia under its control. Those were Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Estonia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Ukraine, and Uzbekistan. Other areas, like Poland, were satellite communist countries of the Soviet Union, even though they were never officially a part of the USSR. World War II left some countries without independent governments, leaving them vulnerable to the Soviets' totalitarian regime. The Soviet Union ruled from Russia's capital, Moscow. World War II also led to the creation of NATO. The Western Union Defense Organization was created in March 1948 by Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, France, and the United Kingdom. The need for a multinational defense organization became apparent after the Soviets initiated the Berlin blockade in 1948. NATO became a reality on April 4, 1949, with the agreement that an attack on one was an attack on all, and all NATO countries would respond to such an event. So there you have it. NATO's original purpose has always been to stop Russian aggression, and so Russia has always pitted itself against the organization. Both saw each other as the enemy. NATO grew to 12 founding members in 1991, and that includes the United States. Other countries were added before 1991 during the Cold War. Those include Greece, Turkey, West Germany, Spain, and an annexed Italian territory. The year 1987 marked the beginning of the end for the Soviet Union when the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, or INF Treaty, was signed. The Berlin Wall that separated communist countries from the free world was broken down in 1989. Germany was reunified with formerly West and East Germany coming under NATO as one country in 1990. The formal dissolution of the Soviet Union happened on December 26, 1991. In 1996, NATO and Russia signed the NATO-Russia Founding Act. This was an agreement to appease Russian concerns. The agreement stated that NATO and Russia do not consider each other as adversaries. But the agreement went further. A document dated March 1991 details discussions between Russia and the West. It is clear from the document that NATO promised it wouldn't expand beyond what was formerly East Germany. Meeting minutes quotes U.S. Ambassador to the United Kingdom, Raymond Seitz, stating, "We made it clear to the Soviet Union, the 2+4 talks, as well as in other negotiations that we do not intend to benefit from the withdrawal of Soviet troops from Eastern Europe. NATO should not expand to the east, either officially or unofficially." A British representative also reaffirmed the general agreement on the matter. This was an important issue for Russia because it stipulated it didn't want NATO encroaching on its borders. It didn't want NATO to isolate Russia from the rest of the world. Yet, NATO continued to add countries to its organization, and most of those extended into Eastern Europe. All but 2 of the 16 countries added were beyond former East Germany, violating the 1991 agreement. Countries joining NATO during this time include the Baltic states, once under Soviet rule. The Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland were added to NATO in 1999. Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia joined NATO in 2004. Then followed Albania and Croatia in 2009 and Montenegro in 2017. North Macedonia was added to NATO in 2020. Finland joined in 2020, 2023 followed by Sweden in 2024. The 2007 speech by Putin in Munich pointed out the broken agreement and the growing control NATO, led by both US money and military power, had globally. Putin didn't like the encroachment coming ever closer to Russia. He also had disdain for the increasing isolationism the global organization was creating for Russia. Putin turned his ire to fighting globalism, and has done much to cut its influence both in Russia and in the world since 2007. He banned non-governmental organizations called NGOs from Russia in 2015 with the Russian Undesirable Organizations Law. He set up a parallel Russian banking system to the one run by the Central Bank of the Russian Federation. The banking system included other Russian banks and non-bank financial companies, branches of foreign banks, as well as a network of shadow companies with offshore wealth. This was strategic as countries in the West started sanctioning Russia. Russia joined Brazil, India, and China to create BRICS in 2009. BRICS is a coalition of economic partners designed to gain global power to compete with the US and the West. South Africa joined BRICS in 2010. There are 9 countries in the coalition now, including Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates. Putin worked with China for international monetary exchange in 2015. The exchange used their own national currencies for bilateral trade instead of the US dollar. The move created more power for both countries, as it lowered the economic pull of the US. All of this was to offset the power Putin saw in NATO. It was a long game that also included military involvement in Syria, deals with Iran, and a war with Georgia. The latest chapter was Russia's invasion and war with Ukraine. Just as Russia fought against NATO expansion, Ukraine sought to be a part of it. It joined NATO's Partnership for Peace in 1994 and the NATO-Ukraine Commission in 1997. It agreed to a NATO-Ukraine Action Plan in 2002 and entered into NATO's Intensified Dialogue Program in 2005. The United States started its diplomatic relationship with Ukraine in 1991 after it became independent from the Soviet Union. While it had elections that elected its government, there had always been tension between Ukraine and Russia over Ukraine's sovereignty. Russia considers Ukraine as part of its territory since its history goes back before the World Wars. Many in Ukraine speak Russian, and the culture is influenced by Russia. Putin uses these as examples of why Ukraine isn't a truly sovereign nation. The US influence on Ukraine is circumspect. There was the dismissal of a prosecutor prior to 2014 under then Vice President Joe Biden's threat. Rumors swirled of the US interfering with the 2014 Ukrainian election that made Volodymyr Zelensky president. That is still debated. Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych was ousted during the Revolution of Dignity. The unrest left Crimea with political unrest, as many protested the new Ukrainian government. The escalated violence led to Russia invading and taking over Crimea. The move by Russia prompted Ukraine to make serious efforts to join NATO, but to no avail. Russia invaded Ukraine in February of 2022, beginning the current war. Ukraine applied to become a NATO member in September of 2022. The U.S. supported Ukraine financially during the war to the tune of $350 billion, plus military equipment. Other countries like the UK, France, and Poland also supported Ukraine similarly with money and equipment. None would put boots on the ground because Ukraine isn't a NATO country, and all feared an escalation of a global war with Russia. Zelensky has been trying to gain the West's support for entry into NATO for the past 3 years. All have held back support because of the 1991 agreement with Russia. Allowing Ukraine to join NATO would be considered an act of war by Russia. The BRICS countries, which have a substantial amount of the world's wealth in gold, oil, and resources, could side with Russia. China would certainly side with Russia. NATO countries would ally, and World War III would take root. Putin's long game of building economic and relationship partnerships with those countries is working to his advantage. Russia's own wealth and his buildup of the military adds to the West's caution of making him an adversary. The 2 times the Russian president chose to invade Ukraine were during periods when U.S. presidents offered a lead-from-behind strategy. The election of Trump offered a change in direction when it comes to Ukraine and NATO. It did away with the lead-from-behind strategy and initiated peace talks. Trump wants Europe to contribute what he calls their fair share to NATO, and is decreasing U.S. financial support. He is also reluctant to defend any country where they haven't contributed well to NATO, or have treated the U.S. unfairly in trade. Trump said NATO has a purpose. He doesn't plan for the U.S. to exit, but he has taken the U.S. out of other global agreements, like the Paris Climate Accord and some United Nations organizations. Trump's standoffish approach to European countries and his approach to leaders like Putin and North Korea's Kim Jong-un shifts the power from a Western global collaboration to one-on-one negotiations. The biggest shift is in aid for Ukraine. Trump and Secretary of State Marco Rubio halted all of it. Rubio stopped everything from money to military equipment and intelligence. It will resume when Zelensky comes to sign a financial loan agreement for the money the U.S. gave and agrees to a ceasefire. European countries, namely the UK and France, agreed to step up aid, but they can't match U.S. resources. This is where Putin's long game is paying off. He has shown the U.S. that Russia is a formidable opponent that seeks a balance of global power with the West. Trump is paying attention and seeks to avoid a world war by negotiating peace between Ukraine and Russia. Part of that peace deal, from Russia's perspective, is that Ukraine doesn't join NATO. That is non-negotiable. Zelensky also made Ukraine's NATO membership a deal breaker. He wants security guarantees. Those would come with NATO membership. Trump refuses to talk about security guarantees and hasn't voiced support for Ukraine's admittance into NATO. In this effort, Putin has won the long game. Time will tell whether his strategy holds to get what he wants out of a peace deal. Did you find this video informative? Like and subscribe to be notified of more like this.